Okay, so moving on to our next speaker. So extreme heat poses a risk to everybody, but obviously it poses the greatest risk to the most vulnerable, and particularly the elderly. So we're going to hear next from Professor Chris Sansom, who's Zero Carbon Lead at the University of Derby, and Gemma Sylva from Derby City Council. And they're going to talk about how they're collaborating to find low-cost cooling solutions for residents living in care homes. So over to you, Chris and Gemma.
Great, thanks, Emma. If you'd like to move on to the next slide then. So very briefly, just a quick overview. This was a project called the Climate Care Project. It was a collaboration between and still is a collaboration between Derby City Council and the University of Derby. It actually ran officially in 2023, but it's still running today. Even though the funding has run out, we're continuing with the project. Had a small amount of money for materials, and you can see a picture of part of the care home on the slide. So if we go ahead now onto the next picture, then the main objectives were, first of all, to make it a thermally comfortable place for the people who actually reside in the care home. To do some thermal modeling to understand the performance of the building, and then look at low cost solutions to dealing with extreme high temperature events. In other words, low cost cooling, assuming that we can't afford very expensive air conditioning. And you can see on the pictures at the bottom the sensors, because we felt we couldn't really do anything until we understood how the building behaved and until we had data. So we collected sensor temperature and humidity data at various points throughout the rather complex building. So if we go on to the next slide, then on the next slide, you'll have a look at, and if you click again, please, on the slide, you'll find that there we go. All I'm going to say here is that we did a lot of temperature measurements and a lot of sensor measurements. So I'm not going to dwell on these, except to say that we gathered a lot of data, because if you haven't got the data, you can't do the scientific analysis. So if we move on from that, the second thing we did, apart from gathering data, was to, on the next slide, you'll see that we also looked at the energy consumption. So this is gas central heating and electricity consumption. And this was to look for patterns in data. So we were looking to understand what the seasonal variations were in the gas and electricity consumption, and we couldn't find any sensible seasonal variation. It looked pretty random to us, more or less. So that told us something about the consumption, that there was something going on that we didn't understand. And if you go forward to the next slide, you'll probably get, well, you will, I'm going to explain why, something that we found which we thought was very odd, that one of the thermostats that actually measures the temperature was outside the building in a shaded area. So in fact, it always was cold. So it assumed that the building was cold inside, and preferentially pumped heat into the building even when it wasn't really needed. So that was an interesting observation. If you move on from there, then the next slide really takes us to the core of what we tried to do, because the building was southwest facing. It's kind of a cross shape, but two of the crosses were south and west facing. So it was basically in direct sunlight throughout the summer for most of the summer time. And so it was clear that what we had to do if we were going to control the temperature in those rooms was find some way, low cost way, to block, reflect and absorb sunlight. And then if you have a look on the next slide, you'll see all the ways that we came up with in which we thought we could do that. So low cost ways to block, absorb or redirect, reflect sunlight. So moving past the energy management in the house, which we dealt with, and looking at putting thermostatic valves on radiators so that not every radiator was operating as part of a system, if you like. So it's an intelligent radiator. We then moved to something I'm going to call blind screens, and you'll see what they are. Solar films, lighting filtration, changing lights to low energy LEDs, low heat generation LEDs, evaporative cooling, reflective paints, and roof coatings. We didn't do all of those. We didn't have permission. We didn't have the budget to do all of those. But I will go through them very quickly. So the first one we tried on the next slide was the thermostatic valves. As I say, I won't dwell on that. You know about thermostatic valves. So let's move on to the more interesting solutions. The first one being a company in Derby called Blind Screen. And they had just developed these honeycomb blinds, which are basically hollow blinds. They can be blackout as well, but not necessarily so. And these produced, as you can see, a temperature drop of up to 17, nearly 20 degrees temperature drop across the blind in direct sunlight. This may not sound very much, but believe me, it is. When you have a very high temperature outside and you can drop it by nearly 20 degrees, that makes a huge difference to the comfort in the room. So these were a great success. And I went to the House of Commons recently with this company who are looking for tax incentives to roll this out across the UK. Good luck with that. But anyway, really good solution. On the next slide, I'm just very quickly going to talk about solar reflecting films. These are plastic films that you can roll out, stick onto your windows, peel off in the winter. You don't have to keep them there all the time. They are quite reasonably low cost, and they will absorb or reflect something like 70–80% of the sunlight. So they can make a big difference, especially on things like conservatories, for example. If we move on to the next idea, which we also tried. So obviously replacing thermally emitting light bulbs with LEDs is a good way to go forward. If you can't do that, and it's not always easy to do this, I understand, you can use filters to filter out the infrared from the light. So that can help, but of course the heat's got to go somewhere. So but you may be able to trap it, but you won't be able to eliminate it. But that can help. On the next slide, I just wanted to say a word for evaporative cooling, which some people think doesn't work and some people think is marvelous. But I guess we've all tried it. I've tried it, just having a fan with some ice in your room if it gets very hot. It does work, and I do recommend it in extreme temperatures. It's very simple and very cheap to try out. So if I move on from there, then just a couple more. Yes, on the roof coatings and reflective paints on the top of a roof to reflect the sunlight from the roof itself. We didn't do this. We didn't have permission or time or budget indeed to do this. But there is a reason why houses are painted white in Mediterranean countries, for example, on their roofs. So I just put this forward as something that could be tried. Okay, thank you. Let's move to, that's it from me. I'm going to pass over now to Gemma to take you through the rest of the presentation. Thank you, Gemma.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Gemma Sylva. I'm the Climate Change and Energy Manager for Derby City Council. And I'm just going to take you through some of the key learnings, particularly from the Council's point of view for this project on the next slide. So it's probably quite important to highlight that this was a council-owned care home. It wasn't a standard facility, as in it's a hospital to home centre. So people were moving in usually for a period of up to 14 days, still as part of their recovery and being able to go home or to a more permanent care setting following being in hospital. So that actually meant that making sure that temperatures weren't too high was even more important for the recovery of those particularly vulnerable people. It's also important to say that, as Chris mentioned, we're still carrying on with this project. We're still gathering data from the care home to date. Particularly the hot weather over the last sort of week or so will be very interesting to interrogate later on and see how the measures that we've installed in the property have been helping with those high temperatures. But we did encounter some quite difficult challenges, I would say, through the course of the project. I mean, the first being the timescale. So we were funded by the LGA through the Net Zero Innovation Programme, and it was a 6-month project with very small amounts of funding, and that wasn't really enough time for us to gather enough initial data and research interventions, procure them all, and manage to install them all on site alongside all of the other limitations which I'll describe shortly. and then it wasn't enough time to monitor their efficacy for a long enough period, really. So that's a major part of the reason why we've continued running this project in our own time. And also, you know, the summer period that we ran the project over wasn't as typically hot as we've grown to expect in the UK. So that's also why we're still running it this summer. Gathering data, as Chris has said already, it's really essential to inform our decision making, both as a project team, but also for us, for the wider council, when we're considering maintenance, investment and wider capital programmes for our care facilities. So we were expecting the usual summer heat, and it actually was cooler than expected, so we weren't able to fully test those interventions. So as I said, the fact that we're still running the project is basically so we can gather enough evidence on the performance of all the installed measures. So we're planning to do that until September, and then conduct some further analysis to decide what to do from that point. And I think finally, another major learning point was around working alongside other internal departments at the council. They do need to be engaged well in advance of any project, because the interventions that we wanted to make needed to be planned in alongside other work, maintenance, which will often mean a longer time scale. And actually that led to us not being able to do as much of what we ideally would have wanted to do, and making it a lot more difficult. And we also needed to understand all the various health and safety and CDM regulations and how that can limit what we had originally planned to do. So you ideally want a property maintenance and an FM team who are engaged and who are willing to be innovative, think outside the box, and to try and find ways around problems with you, so that you can manage to get measures installed around all the various rules and regulations and timescales that we were up against. Alongside this, within this particular facility, there was a need to assess and find solutions to issues such as there being asbestos present within the site, which is clearly quite a concern, and meant that we had to limit any sort of work to do with drilling or disturbing the fabric of the building, particularly due to the short time frame and the very limited budget. But another aspect is around resourcing. So do we have the staff and the budget to maintain any measures that are installed? So for example, we have been considering natural shading through planting, but then issues have been raised over, well, who is actually going to maintain those, for example. So those are some, you know, fairly major challenges, I would say, but we have still been able to make some really useful learnings from this project, and we'll continue to do so, hopefully. And we're now thinking about how we can potentially intervene in other care facilities, so not just adult care homes and obviously across into the private sector, but also children's homes as well, which we do still own and operate some more of too. That's all from me. Thank you.